at the time, I was in a previous relationship where we basically were optimizing life to do triathlon. So I've been an endurance athlete for quite some time. And Central Oregon, Bend specifically, seemed to be just the coolest, where all the cool kids go to swim and bike and run in the mountains. And that was fun for a little while, but then it came apparent of like, bro, this is a hobby. This is not your life. This is part of your life and it's cool, but you need to nail down what you want to do. So I jumped around a few different jobs, some of which didn't really work out. The first one was it was something like customer service rep almost. I was kind of like a project engineer for an advertising company, which was not exactly something that I was super stoked on. And then worked for a small business for a little while in an entrepreneurial setting. That was kind of fun work, but it wasn't quite paying the bills. Then I took on a sort of a management role at this production company, like not media production, but like assembly line type production. And that was kind of soul sucking. So for about 2 years, I bounced around like somewhat haplessly in terms of career trajectory. And I finally got to the point where I was like, okay, I need to seriously get back into the military, at least part-time, to have that going. And it was about the time that previous marriage started to break apart that I discovered this thing called health coaching. And so at the beginning of 2019, I started going to the Primal Health Coach Institute to get my level 1 certification from them. And so that was at the beginning of that year. And around September of that year, I had gone to Nice, France for the 70.3 World Championships. It's half Ironman event. And that was my last triathlon I ever did, which was not a bad swan song in terms of my endurance career as it relates to triathlon. And there's a really cool moment where two things kind of happened at once. I got a phone call from a job I was working at that I really was not very fond of right before I went to Nice. And they basically were like, hey, don't come back to work after you finish your time in Nice. And it was a little bit out of the blue, but I had been struggling with a revelation that I learned about with that previous relationship, and it was not really helping me too much in my ability to focus on my work. But I still had that. I was still going to school for health coaching. It was like I forget how long, it was like a 5-month course. And within the same 5-minute span of having gotten that phone call, I got a completion packet in the mail for my health coaching certificate. So I was like, there's some kind of thread here that I need to pay attention to. And so that was September. When I got back from Nice, I had previously met Magnus Johnson, who's the founder and owner of Mission 22, earlier that month from an unlikely connection with some guys I met at this church retreat. And he told me about this new program he had thought of called Recovery and Resiliency. It was still in the idea phase, and that it had to do with basically all of the lessons that he learned as a Green Beret, kind of getting back into civilian life and working through the loss of his friends through combat, as well as through suicide back home. And he was trying to figure out, like, how is this such a huge issue that I didn't know about? So that was about 10 years ago that he sort of had that revelation, I suppose, and decided to do something about it by founding this company. And so 8 years after that was when this sort of all of that kind of came together in his mind of like, why don't I just take all of the things that I did to heal, package it in a way that's accessible and compressed, and then like make that into a program. And so we kind of met around that time. And at first he was like, well, we'll pair everyone up with a counselor to go through this, like an LPC, licensed professional counselor, and have them kind of help them along their journey. And then I was like, wait a minute, maybe health coaching is more the way to go. And so he hired me as the lead health coach. And after our first cohort of people, we saw how we started asking questions of like, how could we scale this? And then that turned into, we have a whole team of health coaches. And then as we refined our craft, we were like, health coach isn't quite the right descriptor of what we're up to. And we came up with the term post-traumatic growth facilitator. And so fast forward a few years of iterating this, and now we're working on our own course. We're working on publishing a book on post-traumatic growth, and I'm almost done with the master's program in counseling, so we'll still sort of have the academic rigor that comes along with it, as well as just the hard practical experience of going through this process with enough people, enough testimonies, enough surveys, and this and that to show that it works. So yeah, that's where we're at.
Okay, sweet. So what exactly is your role as the post-traumatic stress? How did you phrase it again?
Yeah, so the coaches in the program are termed post-traumatic growth facilitators, and I'm sort of the lead
Post-traumatic growth.
of that team. Yeah.
Hmm. Okay, sweet. And then what's your role? What are the individual roles as the post-traumatic stress like growth facilitators? And then what's your role in organizing or managing that sort of team?
Yeah, so as a facilitator, your role is, it's partly coach, it's partly counselor, it's partly teacher, and this is the question I'm actually attempting to answer by writing some curriculum for our own in-house certification program that's very much early on in the works. But the role is kind of like you're a guide by their side. So you're someone who is helping the individual facilitate a cultivation of an ecosystem, if you will, where growth is most likely to happen. So the majority of people who experience any kind of combat trauma don't come back from it in a sort of traumatized state where if they go to psychiatrists, they'll be diagnosed with what they call PTSD. And part of the reason for that is the same reason that when Vietnam veterans came back from the front lines and they were getting into opiates and other addictive drugs downrange, coming back home, they didn't necessarily have as big of an issue with it. A lot of people thought that there's going to be this huge epidemic of all these Vietnam veterans that were going to be dealing with substance abuse issues, and sure there were, but not to the degree that was worried about. And the reason for that is the context they were in. And if you put the human being in a healing context, the default mode of a person is health. And so a lot of it has to do with removal of the garbage that keeps us sick. And so I look at it as a sort of ecological approach. Like imagine you have those little globes or like these big old balls of glass where you can put like moss and like rocks and like water and snails, and like it's its own self-contained ecosystem. And it's kind of hard to put a finger on like what exactly is happening there for it to work. You just know that if I have this combination of factors and add some sunlight, it just the life develops on its own. So a facilitator kind of does that. And we have particular tools that come within the R&R program that are sort of the analog, I suppose, of, rich soil and sunlight and the right level of moisture and so on and so forth. And the idea is let's put the human being into that situation to allow growth and healing to happen naturally while removing all of the junk. And then if they come to a point where there's too large a gap between that wound and healing, that's when we kind of consider it like, okay, there's something deeper that they need maybe counseling or therapy for. But like 80% of the time, it's probably just going to be the former, where it's like instead of relying on the therapist or psychiatrist to change your meds and do some cognitive behavioral therapy and this and that to try to get you remedied, why don't we put you in an environment where you're going to a gym with other people, you're reading books to help engage your mind on how other people have traveled this journey, specific tools of what you can do. Let's get you meditating. Let's get you eating better. Let's get you on some supplements. Let's get you paired up with a person who's going to hold you accountable, where you can hold yourself accountable. Let's get you journaling every day so that you can constantly take inventory of the trajectory of your life. And then if you're still really struggling after having done that a couple of times, we can start talking about what it would look like to go see the clinician. And I think right now we just kind of have that backwards in our culture.
Okay, yeah. See, so you guys are really taking more of like you're kind of shifting your framework around like almost like a lifestyle change for people who have been dealing with PTSD, and I mean, it's not necessarily like this like clinical view of what it is, and I find that kind of refreshing. I think that's probably something applicable to many, not just combat veterans, but just people that it's almost as if, like you kind of pointed at, when you just start changing your mindset around like how you live your life and kind of what you do day to day, it really has such a profound impact on the way you lead the rest of your life. Like you said, like start exercising, start eating right, start being involved in a community. And I think that's probably one of the things that, it's like, it definitely is one of the things that when you get out of the military, you're so ingrained in this culture that you live with people. You're just constantly surrounded by this group of people that you've been with day in and day out, and then you get out and you just get left wherever they drop you off in the world, and you lack this structure, and you lack this order, and you lack community. And that, I think, for myself, that is the one thing that I didn't realize I was missing. I was just so I was just stoked to be out, and I didn't even realize that I was completely missing this huge factor in my life. And it took me a long time to kind of realize that that was something that I needed in my life, and something that I had before that I no longer had. So what was it that for you that wanted you to get involved in this sort of work personally?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I guess the early manifestation of my desire to do stuff like this was probably back in about 2013 when I learned about another nonprofit that I was a part of called the U.S. Military Endurance Sports Team. And it was basically an organization by military for military, but it's a club team, so it wasn't like DoD sponsored, that reduced the friction for military athletes to get into various types of endurance sports. And I had been doing endurance sports for quite some time during college, and I took like one kinesiology class just for fun because it was a subject that I was really interested in. But the problem was I had my credentials was I was an engineer. So how in the world am I going to make my industrial engineer degree work for helping other people realize health and fitness? Because that's where my deeper calling was toward is helping other people to realize better versions of themselves by way of health and fitness. And so I had kind of that dream of what that might look like. And within about a year after finishing my Army duty, active duty rather. So while I was in active duty, I didn't really have to deal with that question so much because I did take on a kind of leadership role at the U.S. Military Endurance Sports Team for a little while. So I had that in my life. And then my day job was just as a Corps of Engineers officer. And so that worked for a little while until I got out of active duty. I didn't have any type of military stuff in my life there for about 2 years. And I was just doing management work. And it was just not, it was one of those situations where you sort of live for the weekend. And I knew that was not a good place to be. But then at the same time, it was just like, I have this thing in me that I want to figure out how to transform into something that I can call people into. So like for me, teaching and leading others in the capacity of something that enables them to realize more of their health, to help them get physically strong, to help them get mentally strong, to aid in that endeavor is something that, like, for me, doesn't really tax my, capacity nearly as much because it's what I was designed to do. And so that dream was always kind of there, but it took me a while of searching to figure out where it was. And then in some sense it kind of found me, but it only found me when another aspect of my life was dying off. And so there was a really difficult season of transmuting that pain into the creation that I'm allowed to participate in now.
So if for you, this sort of work has always been just something that you've always felt you've wanted to get into, is just kind of, I guess, before you were lacking the I guess, sort of catalyst for it.
Yeah, something like that. I mean, it probably was the case that you need a little bit of wandering before you sort of get to the proverbial promised land.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if we look at ancient stories, like that's what the Israelites did. Like before they figured out, oh, this is the place where we need to go. It's like you're going to be stuck wandering in this sort of desert place for a while.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's part of the story. Because, so I'm reading a book right now called Range by, I believe it's David Epstein. He's the same guy who wrote The Sports Gene. And he makes a case for, the conventional model is start the kids early on, chess or whatever the skill is, because
Mm-hmm.
otherwise they're never going to master it. And like, oh, if you didn't start this and that profession before you're 18, it's too late. And he's like, not really. Actually, it's maybe the reverse. Maybe for a while you need to try out a bunch of different things to figure out what it is you're good at, to figure out a good quality match of what you bring to the table and what the world needs. There's that Japanese concept, ikigai, which describes a state of affairs where the thing that you're good at and you enjoy, and the thing that the world needs, and the thing that you can make money doing all meet in one they're all the same thing. And so finding that is a challenge. It's a challenge for everyone, and especially if you're getting out of the military and you're a Huey operator and like, okay, I guess I'll go work for Boeing or something. But maybe that's not quite lining all those three up. And the fact that you're not able to line those up immediately after your service is not a flaw in someone's character. It's part of the thing. Like it's part of the thing to have to try out a bunch of different stuff.
Yeah.
And I think just by the process of trying things and failing at them and realizing you're not, like, that's not the path that you needed to go down was part of the process. So it's not like, oh my gosh, I wasted all this time just to figure out that it didn't work. No, you spent all that time to get that data. That's really good. That's a good thing that you now know about yourself. So, and in that sense, you don't have to look at, failed endeavors, working at a job for 6 months and getting fired or something or whatever, as like, oh no, I am now, like, my character is just bad and I thought I was this one thing when I was in the military, but I'm really not. Like, no, you don't have to pigeonhole yourself. Specialization is for insects. Like, people should be able to have a broad range of stuff that they enjoy, stuff that they're good at, and an opportunity to explore those things, even if it leads down a path of realizing, no, I didn't really like that. I mean, I started out life as an engineer and now I'm a counselor, and those are two different things on the personality spectrum, So like, one is a profession that's interested in things and the other is a profession that's interested in people. And so it took me, 12 years, 15 years, however you want to look at it, half my life really to like figure out like, oh, okay, this is actually what I want to do and where I want to go.
Yeah, totally. That's something I completely resonate with I think especially getting out, like when I was I joined when I was 18, I got out when I was 23, and I didn't have any other skills, but like working on helicopters and like flying and shooting guns out of them. Like I didn't know what I was doing. Like that was my first job ever. And, like you said, exactly, like I went and got a job at Northrop Grumman that I completely hated, but, it paid well. And then that was that. But I had to quit after 3 months because it just was not aligning with my values and what I felt I could contribute. Not that, it's a bad thing to contribute to that, but there was like this, there was just this dichotomy from who I was towards what I was doing. And it took me a long time to really figure out what that looked like for me. And it took me going through a lot of jobs and a lot of me quitting a lot of jobs and just finding what really pushed me forward. But it was it was a long, difficult process. Like you point out, it's not easy. And I think, like you said, you could view it as like this failure. It's like, oh, well, that job didn't work out and this one didn't work out. Like, what am I doing? And you're kind of just wandering. You're just kind of looking for things to do. And hoping that, it's going to pay off one day, and it will. It's just changing your attitude about what you're doing. It's not just you going from place to place haphazardly. Like, you're actually putting in effort and you're putting in time to gain the experience you need to be the person you want to be later on. But it takes time to figure that out for yourself. For yourself personally. So when did you actually get out of active duty?
Yeah, I was done in active duty like spring of 2017, and I've been doing reserve duty since about the end of 2019.
Okay.
So yeah, I did about 4.5 years doing active duty stuff with U.S. Army Alaska, and yeah, ever since then I've just been doing reserve stuff. Mm-hmm.
Okay, sweet. And so what do you do in the Army exactly?
So right now I'm a company commander. So I'm with the Psychological Operations Unit, which is a branch of the Army that not a ton of people are very familiar with. But basically, it's like, imagine you're working on the information domain, and your job is to use storytelling in order to influence behavior change on the battlefield in a strategic manner. So, some of the audience might be like, oh, you're a propagandist. Like, no, not exactly. There's a very fine line between those things. And basically, it's maybe an example would be easiest. Like the classic PSYOP move would be like in Desert Storm, there was a column of enemy armor that got carpet bombed basically and was just completely destroyed. And there's another column that was like kind of behind it, but several miles back. And the PSYOPers basically took an image from the previous bombing, printed it on a leaflet, and did a leaflet drop all over the other unit, and basically said, here's what happened to your other people. This is about to happen to you unless you leave.
Mm.
And so like that was successful, and they left, and they retreated. So that's like a very hasty, simple example of how PsyOps works. But it's also you can have campaigns that last for years and years, where you're trying to shift the view of different players within a particular battle space or strategic area. So say there's a particular terrorist group that's trying to recruit young kids to come join their ranks, and what basically they're kind of doing a similar thing as what we're trying to do, but for reverse means, or reverse ends, I guess. So in other words, they're looking at their target audience, and they're thinking, what are their vulnerabilities? What are those things that resonate with them in terms of a message where it's like you have this young boy and he like wants to go to the front lines and fight and be that warrior, right? And economically speaking, and even from maybe a brute force perspective, right? If I don't do this, then the Taliban's going to come in and do this to my family, kind of a thing. Like that would be a vulnerability. But another one would just be knowing the kind of how that young man ticks, like what's important to him, going on an adventure, right? Or making some money, or contributing back to the family. And if the enemy can make that pitch to that young man, he's going to make a decision to go join them. So then it becomes our job, and I'm speaking very generically, this is not in reference to any particular operation or anything. It might be our job to go in and like, hey, what would it look like to instead invest within your own village by, for example, taking out a business loan? Like, how can we encourage you to go take that action through another, like a different message, and what resonates with that? So that's in a nutshell some types of things that PsyOp does. So it's okay. There's a lot of overlap between understanding some stuff in psychology that I'm learning on the academic front, as well as like the science of influence very much comes into play when you're a counselor. The way in which that, like where the rubber meets the road with those two things is going to look different, but knowing like, why does that person do this? Why is that person influenced by that? That can then start to open up conversations that you might have with a client, let's say, where it's like, hey, I see that you're having trouble saying no to the cookies. Well, why don't you put yourself around people who are doing things in life that don't include eating cookies, and why don't you make it more difficult for you to access those cookies? And like understand the psychology behind what's influencing that person to make a decision that maybe is running contrary to their value set that they told you that they're trying to adhere to.
Yeah, interesting. How many people do you have working with Mission 22 as somebody seeking help? Like I don't know how you would refer to them.
Yeah, so we're in our program, we go with cohorts that are roughly about a dozen people, 10 to 12 people, and we're opening up cohorts at a rate of about one per month. And right now it's something like 70 people are active participants. We've had about equal numbers of that who have kind of graduated from the program. And within the next year or two, like we're constantly asking questions of how do we scale? How do we make this bigger? How do we impact more people? How can we bring more people into the program? But yeah, our numbers roughly right now, off the top of my head, is somewhere around 150 people have come and gone, and about half of them are active currently. Okay,
great. So what does graduation look like for people? Like how do you transcend the material that you guys offer? Like what does that look like?
Yeah, one of the messages that we're trying to get across, and we're even trying not to use the word graduate, because that implies like, okay, you're done, and you're not. It's like, all right, you've gotten past the hurdle of where the heck do I go? What do I do? What's the next step here? And so I mentioned before, we provide books, we provide supplements, we provide the sort of health coach / facilitator, we provide a gym membership, meditation devices. Like, okay, you have the tools. Now what's next? I think it was Babe Ruth who said something like, yesterday's home runs don't win today's game. And what we're trying to teach is, hey, this is a new lifestyle entirely. And that's a good thing. And the struggle from transitioning out of the military often comes from a thing that many service members will say early on of, why did you start? Why'd you do this? And a very common answer, which I don't think a whole lot of people really think about too deeply, but just sort of know. And I'm not saying this to dispute this, but rather the opposite, where they say, I want to be part of something bigger than me. And it's like, yeah, of course you do. Like everyone does. Everyone wants to be a part of a big story that they play a role in that's meaningful. So what we're teaching here is that the things that you do outside of the service are still part of that story. And so part of the curriculum that we teach is, look, there are timeless stories of, if your audience is familiar with the hero's journey, we talk about that a lot too, where I kind of mentioned it before, like the time going through the desert is part of the deal. And so we want to show you the rest of the story and how you can heal, and how a lot of people's souls are sort of stuck in that dark night from something that they experienced in the military. And we're trying to teach, look, that's part of the deal. And if you can learn to transform that darkness into something else, you've just found the meaning of your life after military service. As Carl Jung put it, the meaning of your suffering is the meaning of your life. And this is sort of the wounded healer model that we're trying to get across. And everyone, I would venture to say, who is in sort of a helping relationship with our participants have themselves gone through their own dark nights of the soul. And so when you have a whole cohort of military members who understand, like, oh, this is now part of the story, the process of working through that really difficult time is the thing that lays the groundwork and serves as the raw material for the rest of my life. And how that ends up working out is the beauty of the human drama. And we've seen that with various participants, some who go on to race professionally in cycling, some who open up yoga studios, some who reconcile with family members that have been long lost. And a lot of these actually are documented on, if you go to YouTube and just type in Mission 22 and find our page, there are a couple of mini documentaries that talk about each of these stories. And that's what we're trying to call people in with this program.
Yeah, awesome. It definitely hit on some great points there. I mean, you're so used to one subset of your, I guess, like one foundation for yourself while you're in, and then when that eventually ends, you kind of have a loss of foundation for yourself, and then it's like seeking a new foundation, and it seems like that's what you guys are trying to bring to your participants. I guess my question like aims towards the severity of how, or what type of participants you guys deal with. How I mean, I'm sure you guys get a range of different traumas and experiences from people. What has it been like for you guys dealing with the range of severities that you can deal with dealing with this type of these type of matters?
Yeah, interesting question. One of the areas that we've been researching is what exactly is the nature of post-traumatic stress disorder. That phraseology has only been around for 43 years. It was introduced in the DSM-3 back in 1980. And prior to that, whatever that condition was, we had something like 80 different names for it. So there's probably a threshold where someone, we could say, has a disorder. In other words, there's a blockage within their life where they have trouble, say, putting their shoes on, remembering where they put the keys. Like they just can't, like the functionality of living is impaired. But then there's also like probably a pretty significant subset of people who, it's not quite that they're disordered per se, it's just they don't have the tools and the understanding necessary to be able to manage their stresses on a day-to-day basis. As I talked about before, they don't have that ecosystem that facilitates that growth. So we do have a screening process where if someone is in active addiction, for example, this is not an addiction program. And while many people have had substance abuse problems in the past who are currently in the program, for those who are like actively dependent on a substance, this program's not for them. And we do screen for if someone is not in touch with reality, so some type of psychosis, this program is also not them. But we're pretty open to many different, let's say, not walks of life, but conditions, I guess. I don't want to use too clinical of a term because I want to be careful about using my language of putting those types of health issues as labels for people. But those who do join the program do volunteer previous diagnoses. And Again, diagnosis is not your destiny at all. It's just a thing. It's largely a thing for insurance companies. One thing that we learned about is that if you look at the diagnostic manual for post-traumatic stress disorder and you figure out, well, how many, so basically it's like what they call 3 different symptom clusters. There's basically affectivity, which is kind of your emotional presentation, to use this clinical term. There's hypervigilance, and then there's like flashback episodes, like reoccurring memories. But then within each of those, if you go into the manual and look, there are different levels of severity of each one. And the criteria to meet each of those needs, there's so many different combinations. It's unbelievable. It's something like 600,000 different symptom presentations that might fall you, like that might land somebody in the category of PTSD. So it's like, well, do we really understand what this thing is? And one of the issues with diagnosing mental health disorders is like we can't pop the hood and like see like with a tumor or something, right? Like, oh, there it is. It's if someone's like, hey, I'm anxious and I'm depressed, like, okay, which mental disorder is that? Because that crosses over just about all of them. That's like saying I have a fever. Okay, well, what sickness do you have? It's like it's a fever, and it could be just about anything. So that's a long way of saying there are a lot of different backgrounds for individuals' mental health that the program has worked for very well.
Do you find that there's like a certain type of individual that responds most well to this type of treatment that you guys offer?
It's going to be somebody who is committed to the process. So if it's a person who's kind of looking for another handout from a charity, it's not going to work because this is going to require participation. We don't call them clients, we call them participants because they get to do the work. It's a lot of work. So it's for the people who are willing to put in an extra, somewhere between 4 to 10 hours per week, specifically on the elements of the program, they're going to do well. In the military, a lot of our training, the cadre will say something like, you get out what you put in. And that's exactly this program. It's not going to be, you're going to go sit on a couch and we're going to fix you. Quite the opposite. We're going to give you the tools so you know what to do to heal yourself. Because we believe that healing kind of comes from the inside in your own journey. But there are also commonalities among people's healing journeys that we've kind of coalesced into this box. So anyone who is willing to take responsibility for their own process and being willing to learn is going to do well here.
What do you find to be like the inhibitor of people like finding that or finding within themselves the strength to kind of be able to be the person that overcomes some of these things that they're having trouble with? Is there something that you can, or I guess like a tendency in people that kind of makes it difficult for them to get through the curriculum?
Yeah, I mean, there are a couple different ways to talk about that. What comes to mind right away is the parable of the sower, where some seeds, fall on thin soil and they spring up very quickly, but then when any adversity comes, they wither away. Some seeds fall on concrete and hardly sprout up at all. And other seeds find deep soil. And for those who, I guess, inhibitors could be a lot of different things, right? It could be like a specific life stress that happens right about the same time that someone receives the box. I think a major inhibitor is just not being open and honest about communicating what the needs are, or not realizing the level of commitment here. And the program isn't for everyone because not everyone wants to learn to read a book every month. Not everyone wants to know how to meditate. Not everyone wants to go to a jiu-jitsu or CrossFit gym, 3 days a week. Hey, no harm, no foul. But that's like, if you're not willing to do that stuff, it's not going to work for you. But what we do promise is that if you pour into everything that this program has, your life will be different by the time you finish.
How long is it, and what does the actual like syllabus look for you guys? How is it structured?
Yeah, so there are 2 different tracks. There's one that's like a 6-month program that's more tailored for just about any different veteran, but not necessarily a combat veteran. There's a 12-month program that's specific to combat veterans, and a lot of the changes are just the topics of the books, because the 12-month program gets more into healing from combat trauma specifically. And then there's also a 6-month program for spouses of veterans who, talk about an overlooked graphic. There's a kind of depressing trend where if a veteran starts to heal from their combat or whatever types of trauma they have, they'll find they start to become a different person. which also means that the spouse's relationship to them has to shift too. And sometimes spouses can get into a pattern of, oh, I'm the caregiver. This is now the role that I have. And so it's my job to, like, I don't want to say pamper, but it's this weird sort of codependency type situation where it's like, as long as you're this sort of traumatized, this is my veteran that I'm taking care of, you know, and then if that role is threatened by the veteran not needing that type of care moving forward, that in itself can cause conflict. And so part of what the spouses program is teaching is that you can change along with him or her, and that's a good thing. And then the curriculum, I've mentioned a couple of different components of it, but we've got biometric devices where they can check real-time stress scores and how their nervous system is operating. We have an online curriculum, which is accessible to anyone. If you go on mission22.com and go to programs, there's one called Elements, which there's a lot of sort of material that everybody in the R&R program has access to as well. So that's public facing. It's easy to do. And an array of books that go everywhere from, like, there's a book called Transitions, and then there's one called Atomic Habits, which you might be familiar with. James Clear wrote that one. It's sort of like the go-to book for understanding habit change and human behavior change and what you do about it. And then every box comes with a range of supplements that are specifically tailored to kind of help heal the body from the perspective of a nutritional standpoint, and to fill in some gaps that the American diet kind of leaves open.
Great. What is the curriculum based in, like, in terms of like the academic side of, like, where you're getting what you offer?
Literally, it's based in Magnus Johnson's healing journey, and his basically he took, like, what was most effective for him and put it into a program. Okay. And I had some influence on it as well. And of course, there are lots of other people along our individual journeys that contributed. Like, for example, he came across a book called War in the Soul, which is written by Dr. Edward Tick, who is a PhD, who's done a ton of research on, you know, if a veteran comes into the psychiatrist's office and says, my soul's still in Vietnam, like, what do you do with that? And so he explores that concept. That was one of the first books that we presented. But it's not like, as far as the flow of the curriculum, a lot of it is created whole cloth between our journeys, and that's I kind of alluded to it before, but we're working on making a coaching certification program that it's an amalgamation of a lot of different things. And so that's really what the heart of this program is collecting together a lot of disparate healing modalities and stories into a singular thing, which is kind of it's the same concept as the Greek word logos, and the logos means a collection together of meaningful things. And so that's what we're trying to be up to here, and having conversations like this, having dialogue with others who have gone through the program, that's what continues to kind of update us. So it's not like we have figured something out that's brand new and has never been done before. I would say that it's never quite been done in this way, which is why we have a patent pending for the program. But it's a continuation of a story that started a long time ago, and we're just trying to recapitulate that into modern terms and making it accessible to as many people as we can.
Yeah, definitely. For yourself personally, how has counseling brought you? I guess how was doing this and counseling through this organization helped you on your journey moving forward?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And there was probably the first year I worked there, I was kind of going through my own dark night of the soul, if you will. And I think one of the biggest things that it did for me is to help me understand the value of mentorship, and knowing that there's someone who is on the side of you that, well, put it this way. I've heard it described that hell is a place where who you could be meets who you are. And to have someone in your life who is on the side of who you could be and who is calling you to that, while also not, like, condemning you for where you are now, is huge. And that's part of what a facilitator does in our program. And so it's opened my mind to the the level of dialogue that I can have with people, the reach that our program can have the power of shared storytelling and bringing together lots of other people who are kicking butt in their own ways, and seeing what happens when you continue to allow all of that stuff to kind of marinate and come together. And so the concepts and principles and ideas within the program, a lot of it had to do with Magnus's journey. A lot of it had to do with me and Magnus's conversations, but a ton of it had to do with like feedback from the participants themselves, with a lot of the other people that work with in R&R. I mean, I don't want to paint this picture that's just like two dudes up in a high tower just dispensing some stuff that we came up with. It's not that at all.
Yeah, totally. So what is the feedback? So like what is I guess, would you be able to speak on the successes of your work and how it's translated into people's lives, and how they've kind of responded to it, moving past the program once they get out?
Yeah, definitely. It's one of the things that we're trying to do a little bit better of is follow-up studies, figure out like where, sort of a where they now type series. Mm-hmm. But what I'll say is that when you put humans into an environment where healing has the best chance of happening naturally, it is a beautiful thing to see where people can go with that. And when you really start to allow people to adopt mindsets where they can see themselves as people who change and make differences in their lives. So we had somebody who said, hey, this is one of the females that was in the program, was like, hey, I started menstruating again. And that had never happened before. So her hormone health got better. And so we thought, like, man, what if like through participating in this program, new children could be born? Like, that's pretty incredible. We've had people who are getting like 2 to 3 hours of sleep a night, get full rest again. You can imagine, like, if you're not resting, you're not healing, and being able to shift that has been pretty tremendous. Time and again, we hear people say things along the lines of 6 months in this program was better than 3 years of therapy at the VA. So I'm not trying to disparage the VA, and that's a whole other conversation, but just the fact that people are finding that here and finding like, oh, this is not me just alone on this journey. There are other people here that can do this. I had an interview with somebody last week who had just completed 6 months of the program. She got a cancer diagnosis earlier on. I don't know exactly the timeline, but she basically was like going through that journey as well as going through a journey of getting out of a toxic relationship. And this program basically enabled both of those things to occur. This program is not a cure for cancer. Okay. Just, as far as I know. I mean, who knows, but anyway, that just went along with her story. And it's just so cool. And she's starting a new business. And when people are allowed to just unlock what's already there, tremendous things can happen. And what's so fulfilling as the director of the post-traumatic growth facilitators is just hearing from their stories of what people are starting to do. Mm-hmm. People who were basically just not quite bedridden, but just isolatory and just didn't want to get out, are out running marathons and doing ruck challenges and engaging with the family again. Just the stories are as diverse as the people who go through this program, and it's to watch.
Yeah, that's great. The way I kind of see it as there could be so much benefit to all of this work you put into yourself, but at the same time, my mind kind of goes to the people that aren't, they're not, for whatever reason, they're just not willing to put in the work, and that's such a big, it's a huge statement for everybody. But like being the person that is able to kind of realize that they need a change in their life, it could be a difficult road to even come to that point. What do you have to say to the people that aren't ready to put in the work, like aren't for whatever reason just haven't the ability right now to be able to commit to something like this that would bring positive impact to their lives? They're just unable to do it mentally, physically, for whatever reason.
Well, I mean, I suppose it depends on who I'm talking to, but the first thing that comes to mind is excuses have an expiration date. So in the movie The Life of Pi, I don't know if you're familiar with them, but there's basically, the movie is about this kid who was on this, for all intents and purposes, an ark where, like, his parents had a zoo and they were trying to go across the ocean to go open a zoo somewhere, and the boat ends up sinking, and Pai Patel, who's the main protagonist, is stuck on a raft with a couple of the animals, and eventually it's just him and this tiger, and the tiger is an analogy for his sort of inner self, or the shadow, to put it in Jungian terms. It's basically that part of you that's capable of being a monster. So at one point, he comes across this very strange island, and the island was a huge relief, because it had days and days and maybe even a month that he'd been out at sea, lands on this island and is able to get sustenance. He and the tiger just like are able to eat as much as they need to. They find fresh water. But then that night, as Pai is reclining in a tree, he sees all the little fresh water pools on the island start to devour the fish that were in there. And he opens up a lotus leaf or flower and finds a tooth in it. And the camera zooms out and the island is in the shape of a corpse. So that's very strange. Why would the island during the day give life and then at night breed death? And the reason for that is because there are points along the journey that you need to take a break and find some life, but you can't stay there. So what does that look like in practical terms? Well, if someone is, say, bouncing from charity to charity, or getting dependent on, I have to have my benefits from the VA or else my life can't be lived, I'm not saying that all benefits are, wrong to pursue or whatever. Again, it's a whole nother story we could get into, but you can stay there. And you might have some reasons for why you can't do a marathon. You might have some reasons for why life has been very tough for you up to this point. Okay, what are you going to do about it? Like, at some point, excuses have an expiration date. And there are people at the other end of the spectrum where maybe they have earnestly tried to get there. So you have, on one end of the spectrum, you have people who ask for, it's sort of like, I'm trying to get back what I deserved. And there's this certain talk mentality you can have about, like, well, the military, they owe me this because of all of the terrible assignments I had to do. And you kind of have to thread a needle here, because, like, yeah, I get it. Like, if there's a service-connected disability, I get the whole compensation idea. At the same time, I mean, like, you can't just go around making yourself dependent on external things to fix you. That's not a good way to go about it. You're not going to find healing if you're relying on someone else or some other entity to heal you. Like, only the work that you put in and the sacrifices that you make can open the door to that healing. I would say that if you're ever relying on an external thing to heal you, can only be higher power. And I'm not talking about a bureaucracy. I'm not talking about a government. I'm not talking about a military or even a community of people. There has to be some higher order thing that you're setting your life to. So in the story of Life of Pi, that thing was basically returning back home. You'll never be able to return back home, in a sense. Your soul will never be able to return back to your body from that trauma unless you're willing to give up an old way of being. And so what that looks like for each person might not be the R&R program that I've been talking about, but it could be something else. Like, that old part of you has to die, and that hurts, but it's the only way that you're going to grow into something new. And so that's the story. That's, the theme that I've been talking about all morning. It's part of the deal to suffer the loss of your previous self. So how do you do that? Well, maybe the R&R program is the way. Yeah.
And I think through that journey, you kind of realize that, it's not a bad thing to be able to let go of that. There, like with anything, there are pros and cons to any way of living. No way of organizing your life is the perfect way of organizing your life. And it's not perfect how it was structured before, and it never will be. But kind of finding the meaning within the journey of it all. Do you find that your participants know what they want, or are they just pretty? Do they find themselves being more direct with what they are pursuing, or are they kind of just pretty lost, I guess, for lack of a better word?
It really just kind of depends on what part of life they're in before they come into the program. You might have somebody who's you know, I worked with, there's this one guy who works in Hollywood, um, and he was a Marine Corps veteran as well. Had like pretty successful career and a lot of things he was looking forward to in the media world, but had kind of come to this sort of dead end, had gained a lot of weight, was losing his meaning and purpose in life, and, had a lot of really good talent artistically, but just sort of like was in a doldrums where just there was no more wind in sails. He joined the program, put in a ton of effort, and like has turned things around completely. Now he's still basically in the same career, but now there's like a much deeper why behind it. And so you have that, and then you have people on the other end of the spectrum of just like are sort of in between. And this is like, I'm willing to try damn near anything because I'm at the end of my rope, and I'm not really sure what I want to do with my life. The story of Tucker, I'll share her name because it's on our YouTube page, tells that journey too, where it was just like, I've reached like the very end of my rope, and this is the last knot. And like with a lot of things in life. She has a couple of kids that she's taking care of, and now she like figured out where she could volunteer and put all this effort toward, and she has a whole rebuilding story of herself. So yeah, that question is hard to just answer with a singular, everybody has their idiosyncrasies when they come here, but everybody also has kind of this pattern of like looking for something deeper.
Yeah, totally. No, I mean, yeah, it's like we're all just trying to, I guess we're all just trying to find purpose in what everything that we do. Like there's always like this inherent, like this, like we alluded to in the beginning of the conversation, this inherent like foundation we're trying to set for ourselves with meaning. Like there's being part of a bigger purpose. And it's through the journey of everything that you find it. And there's different types of meaning for different types of people. For yourself personally, dealing with the cases that you've dealt with and the participants that you've dealt with, what is meaning to you? How does well, I guess, it's kind of like diving into the understanding of what meaning is. How would you describe for yourself personally what meaning is for you?
I think meaning for me is having a roadmap of where to go next, and having it with enough resolution for me to be able to understand minute to minute. So what do I mean by that? I've never quite had like a clear vision, like a vision in the sense of like the biblical version of like, you imagine like, oh, there's this light coming down from the heavens and I see these angels coming in. I've never had anything quite like that, but I did have this image that was very prominent in my memory that I still remember quite well, where basically it's something like a hierarchy of dreams, art, and action. And so it's like a reverse pyramid where the dreams you could think of as like your vision for your life. Where exactly are we going? You can't quite, like a dream is a curious thing. This is also a psychoanalytic way of looking at it. This is, like Freud and other psychoanalysts would talk about dreams in this way, where it's sort of like an initial pass at understanding where you need to go in life. So then what connects your dreams, that's nebulous, you can't really put a finger on it, vision, to your daily actions? Well, there's something in between that's something like art or song, or like if you watch a musical, or you look at some art like a painting or something, it's an expression of something that's not quite words, but still tangible. You can still kind of put your fingers on it, or sing it. Poetry would fall into that category. And then your action is just like, what little step do I take next? And so meaning is a coherence between all three of those things, where the actions that you're taking are getting you closer to that sort of nebulous dream that you have in life. And so I think being able to facilitate a way of life where the connection between those things can be made is the thing that helps you to understand that all of your actions on a daily basis are contributing to something bigger. And I think that's a huge antidote to the nihilistic tendencies that one can have after a traumatic experience, where one feels like, well, the hell with it, like this is all over. That dream is shattered. Like, yeah, that dream is shattered so that anyone could be made, right? Yeah. So that's a whole process that I would hate for anyone to go through alone. So that's what meaning is to me.
Yeah, in that sense, would you describe that as meaning as something more out there, like something separate from yourself, or like outward and less internal?
It's probably both. So there's a sense in which, like, I don't believe in, like, some existentialists will talk about that in terms of like, well, all meaning is subjective and you get to create your meaning.
Mm-hmm.
And Viktor Frankl made a pretty good case for that to an extent. But I think there's a corollary to that where you were put here on purpose as well. So there was a reason for your initial conception. There was a reason that your heart beats in your chest without you having to do anything with it. So I think it's a journey of co-creation,
Mm-hmm.
figuring out where do my individual steps and my free will coincide with the sovereignty of my creator. And it's the mysterious paradox of like the sort of the age-old theological question of divine sovereignty and human will. And I think that kind of gets to where do I discover my own purpose while being plugged into a bigger thing that put me here to begin with. And I think that's it, man. Like, everybody has their own kind of story, but it can also map onto a bigger story. And when we lose that mapping, that's when we start to try to figure out other solutions in philosophies that fall short.
Yeah. So you consider yourself a religious person?
Yes.
Okay. So yeah. And what religion do you subscribe to?
I'm a Christian.
Cool. Is that something that is a part of your organization at all, or is it separate?
Yeah, so we get the question a lot if we're faith-based, and the easiest answer would be to say we're kind of faith-based in the same way that AA is, where on the one hand, I'm going to tell you what church to go to. I'm not going to tell you what confession to make per day, as in terms of like my role as a post-traumatic growth director. What I will say is that it doesn't work without God. It just doesn't work without a higher power orientation, if you want to use a slightly different term.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of what I'm getting at before, is like, how do you find a lasting meaning and value set on solid ground without something transcendent? And my argument is that you can't. And, you know, like anything else is you're kind of staking your claim on a delusion. Like, oh, well, we're just here for our genes to propagate and we're just dancing through our DNA. Like, no, I'm sorry. Like, for traumatic healing, it doesn't work that way, because a lot of people can't propagate their DNA. A lot of people can't, follow along a mere evolutionary path. We have something more. Why else would Elon Musk send a car out into space? Like, we need a bigger thing to grasp. And that's like the idea of grand narrative of this bigger thing that we're a part of necessitates there's something larger out there. Mm-hmm. And so, and then here's one other thing I would say about that. One of the most critical components of learning to move on from trauma is understanding the concept of forgiveness. And I think this by itself is one of the strongest cases for why something higher is needed in this journey. And the reason for that is because when we think of forgiveness, it's like, well, that just means they got away with it. Like, no, that's not exactly. So we could probably do a whole nother long podcast on this, but we misunderstand what forgiveness means. And basically, forgiveness is basically cutting your own tie to the perpetrator. You don't even have to tell them that you forgave them. Like, you do it within yourself so that you don't become a slave to the event that happened to you. That's what forgiveness is. Forgiveness is giving up your right to get even on sort of like a cosmic scale sense. So you might think like, well, people get away with stuff and I want justice to be done. Well, forgiveness is not mutually exclusive justice per se, but it's also true that people do escape the human justice system. And you might think like, well, we need to fight to make sure that that doesn't happen. Okay, fair enough. But people do escape that. And not, the human court system serves a purpose and serves as a deterrent for people to do terrible things. But it's also the case that, like, you can forgive someone and then the murdered family member is still gone. So what exactly is going on there? So it's kind of like, well, there's a rift in. So imagine like you have like a flat sheet of paper and then someone puts a kink in it. And the kink is like the wrong that's been done, the perpetrator, their actions. And so it's like, oh, I forgive them. Well, it's like, say you go out to dinner with somebody and you're with a friend, and you just are absent-minded that day and you forget your wallet. And the waitress comes and says, hey, so here's the bill. And then you say, oh, my friend here, he forgot his wallet, but I forgive him. It's like, okay, you must be a very nice person. Who's going to pay the bill? Right. So there's like forgiveness comes with a cost as well. There's a cost that has to be paid to undo that kink.
Mm-hmm.
So my argument is forgiveness works to undo kink on sort of a cosmic level, if you will, because there's been some sort of sink, some sort of drain where it's all paid for. And on my worldview, that's paid for through what happened on the cross. So like, forgiveness works because the thing that's being paid has already been done for everyone. But it's a matter of the individual to participate in that.
Mm-hmm.
And that can be a really powerful thing for healing. And again, you necessarily have to ascribe to Christianity if you have your reasons, and that's, I respect that. But my case to be made is like, what's the alternative? You're going to be resentful and bitter to that person? You're going to hold on to a grudge your entire life? Does that help?
Mm-hmm.
I just don't see a better alternative.
Yeah. No, I understand what you're saying. Forgiveness also is applicable not only outside or outwardly, but internally. I think that is, for myself, one of the biggest hurdles I had to overcome when I got out and when I was dealing with my own traumas of like what I participated in while I was in the military. And I think that's such a huge issue for many veterans who get out, especially when they start reconciling with some of the things that the military has placed them in, some of the things that they've done, and being willing to, take responsibility for things and what you've done, while at the same time allowing forgiveness to yourself, and learning to find within yourself to look at yourself objectively and not so in not such a harsh way. How have you guys in Mission 22? I guess how has that been dealing with people that have troubles forgiving themselves for some of the things that they've had to overcome and had to deal with while they were in the military?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Part of forgiving is accepting first. Is accepting that there is a difference between actions and individual character. In other words, the stuff that you do does not define who you are. And that can be really tough to look back and see like, oh my gosh, I cannot believe that I did that. And part of the work of integration, to use, again, going back to the psychoanalytic idea, integration is this idea that everybody has a monster inside of them. And you can either allow that monster to continue to perpetuate terrible things, or come to understand, come to accept that exists within you, but then you can put it under control, right? Jordan Peterson has that great line, a good man is not a tame man, a good man is a dangerous man who has that under control. So the thing that I would say to someone who's really struggling with accepting a thing that they might have done downrange is to realize like, it's not a failure of character or a failure of who you are as a human that you did that thing. It's a realization that that's the depth in which you can go. But no tree can grow up to heaven unless it's reached down to hell. So by realizing your capacity for doing evil, you can do good. And the words of John Steinbeck in East of Eden, this really great line that says, and now that you don't have to be perfect, you can be good, which gives me chills just saying it, because it's such a profound lesson where we think we need to be this perfect individual. We have this ideal of who we are in our heads that in itself, that has to die off too. Like I thought that I was this idealized self and I'm headed in that direction. But well, I did this terrible thing, where it was in the military, let's say, or in combat. But what I'm trying to say is like, yeah, you realize that you can do that. And so that means that you can realize it's reverse, right? So God made warriors too, in the Hebrew Old Testament, right? There are many stories of like battle scenes where, you have the men of the cult going out and like hand-to-hand combat. Like imagine what they did. David cut off a guy's head and like paraded it around. You know what I mean? Like, and so that's not mutually exclusive to understanding who you are as a human. I think actually it's the reverse, and that can be a gift. It can be a gift to understand the capacity for bad that you can do, because then you can understand the capacity of good that you can do.
Yeah. It just can be especially difficult when some of the things you can undergo in the military, through your service can be, almost just unfathomable to face, for some people. And, that's why veteran suicide is so high. And, the issues that you have to face within yourself can be such a difficult thing where it's just unfaceable for some people. How have you and your organization dealt with some of the things that people don't want to face, in terms of, you could do a lot of the right steps to help improve some of your life aspects, but there are still demons within everybody that they just don't want to face. Is that something you try to pull out of people, or try to help with as best you can?
So I'll illustrate that point with a story. The degree to which individuals are willing to face into the abyss of their own soul. I think it was Nietzsche who said something like, you have to look into the abyss long enough until the point where it starts to look back. And that's the same idea as understanding your capacity for doing bad. And so there's this weird story in the book of Numbers, which the original name of that book was Into the Wilderness. So the context is that wilderness sort of time between tyranny and the time before you get to the promised land, where you have Moses who was commanded, like, so the situation was you had all these people who were getting bit by snakes. It's a very strange thing. The snakes kept coming into the camp and biting people, and they were dying. And Moses goes to Yahweh and he's like, call off the snakes. This is not working for us. And so the instruction he was given was like, okay, you're going to make a bronze snake and wrap it around a pole and put it in the middle of the camp for people to look at. It's like, what? Like, you're looking at the snake as the thing that cures you from the snake? But actually, that's a rather sophisticated idea, because that's exactly what prolonged exposure is, which is a very well-established method to help people overcome fears. Mm-hmm. You look at the thing that is scaring you. You don't leave unwanted things hidden in the fog. You have to look at it and expose it in order to transform it. In a lot of mythological lore that centers around dragon fighting in the Middle Ages, you often will see whenever the knight slays the dragon, he often makes armor out of the dragon itself. And that's this idea of integration. So slaying the dragon is a process of using your speech, which is the sword, by the way, right? It's your weapon. The weapon is the sword, and putting into words, putting into articulatable form your story and what happened and what you could do, so that you could then put on that armor and take it into future situations. Mm-hmm. So by bringing into the light the darkness that you took part in allows you to then integrate that thing to transform it and transmute it into gold. It's sort of like that old alchemical concept of being able to transmute lead into gold. And, I don't know of anybody who literally took those chemicals and transformed them. I think it's more of a psychological idea where the thing that is most rejected becomes the cornerstone of the rest of your life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's like almost one of those things where if you could face the worst things in your psyche, you could almost face anything, and that's, it's an incredibly difficult process. I think like they always seem to come back to the phrase, like, it's all difficult. It's all extremely difficult to do these things, to improve, to grow, to move along your journey in a way that is gonna affect your well-being later on. It's very difficult, but it's not impossible. And I think that's what people can, who lose hope, they lose the ability to believe that it's possible to change and to get help, and to like really look at themselves and to find some sort of way out of it. But that's, it becomes it's extremely difficult to do and not easy. And I think that's why organizations like yours are very important to kind of even help people before they get to that point, because you could spend years contemplating these things and never get the true help or true community around you to help you push through these things, and then that just festers in your mind for years, and eventually it just becomes unbearable for a certain type of person. A question I wanted to touch on was the idea of a stigma around the military from people who haven't been in or who haven't served. And that's something that I held close to me when I got out, was something that I didn't want to face the fact that I was in, because I felt I had done a lot of things that I wasn't proud of, and just being part of organizations that I didn't align with morally, and part of things that I didn't align with morally, it hurt me to even think about it, and let alone have a conversation about those things with other people. And so that kind of forced me to disassociate, or at least, I had the mentality to kind of disassociate from other people who have served. What has your organization done to kind of, or at least how does your organization view the stigma behind military service that can sometimes be associated with some of the things that are not so great about serving, some of the things that you're forced to do?
The first time I really came face to face with that particular issue someone might have with military service was when one of our previous participants was having like a very, let's say, depressive episode where he had basically kind of given up. He'd gone through the program, but was still like really struggling with some stuff. I had built a little bit of rapport with him after having a phone call with him. It's like a year prior. So he knew who I was. We were kind of texting back and forth. He didn't want a phone call, but he was willing to talk in that capacity. And I was attempting to kind of draw out of him that initial drive to join the military and sort of be a part of something bigger. And I asked him, like, what'd you do in the service? And with a couple expletives thrown in there, he was like, I got put into the worst possible unit the entire DOD had to offer. And it was some like, basically like a morgue is where he worked. And it was like, oh, okay. Like maybe, all right, we'll go down a different path here. And so that helped me to understand it's not the case that everyone sees their service as honorable. And when civilians basically are, good-hearted civilians are trying, hey, thank you for your service. It's so great that you made the sacrifice. And for you, it might feel very disingenuous. Like, I hated what I did. I can hardly live with myself based on what I did in the military. And I wouldn't say that's the majority, of course. But that's also not to say that, like, it's tough. Like, when you hear, oh, thank you for your service, it can be a double-edged sword. It's like, okay, good. I'd rather have that than what happened after Vietnam, where you get spat on, of course. But it's also true that not everybody would thank themselves for their service, if that makes sense. So what do we do to address that? I think it's more of just an invitation into a cohort of service members who are turning in past stuff into something new and following that pattern. And all of us are veterans here. So it's not like, if you're bringing shame to this, like that's not what we're about. We're about building a community that sees our darkest times of our life as the raw material to build something new. And so telling that story again and again with different people, with different perspectives, with different walks of life behind it, I think generates this sort of flywheel effect in our culture of like, hey, if you want to go and transform the worst part of your life into what's going to be the best part of your life, you go to Mission 22.
Yeah, I think that's, yeah, I mean, it is like I said at the beginning, it's this reframing of what happened. Nothing changes, like nothing inherently changes. You've still done the things you've done, and it's all happened. It's all played out the way it's played out, but it's your framework around it. It's your idea of how you view it that's what allows you to find a foundation for yourself and organize it in a way inside your mind, which you can live with and deal with it and work off of. And it's not like it has to hold you back. I think that just becomes with with just being mindful of what you do and how you think about certain things. And that's like, it always comes back to that, what not, kind of thinking about things in a different way. But when you're not even aware that you're thinking about certain things in a specific way, it becomes difficult. And this is kind of what I want to touch on with you, and what you have talked about with having like a meditation practice, and which is like so important, just to be aware of what you're thinking, because you can get so caught up in the cycle of you just ruminating on your own thoughts and what everything you've done and all the traumas you've had to deal with, and without realizing that you don't have to be identified with those sorts of thoughts. How is Mission 22? Like, what is your specific mindset behind having like a meditation practice? Because this is just a question I ask because it's something that I find immense value in. It's something that I found for myself outside of when I got out, and it became extremely invaluable to me. So I kind of want to hear your guys' perspective on it.
Yeah, so we have a couple of different devices that help people onboard to meditating, because a lot of, imagine you're rough and tough 18-year-old Iowa farmer who goes downrange, gets out 4 years later, and gets into the program and like, meditation, what? That's the stuff that hippies do.
Yeah.
And that's the worst Idaho accent ever.
That's how I felt though.
The point is, you have people who this is brand new to. And so we have a couple of devices that basically show you like you're doing it. Now, the concept behind meditation, and this isn't something that we came up with, but we looked at, like in Sanskrit, their word for meditation means to become familiar with. We talked about looking into the abyss. And so being able to sit with yourself, whatever feelings you're having in the moment, and just be aware of them instead of trying to avoid them. That's right. Like, that's the opposite of looking onto that bronze snake, right? It's like, to continue to avoid is where you go and you get into trouble with the snakes, right? The snake represents just the thing that pops up, like the little bit of chaos that pops up in your life at random times. That's the concept of the snake. And so in the Hebrew language, the psalmist refers to meditation as soft repetition to oneself. So then it's a combination of becoming aware of something much more intimately by soft repetition. So a lot of awareness practices will focus on like, well, anchor to your breath, become aware of this and that. And it's practicing kind of your focus muscle, where you're allowing I think it was Richard Foster, he wrote a book called In Celebration of Discipline. There is a chapter on meditation in there, and he describes it as the head descending into the heart. And so it's sort of it's a practice of full alignment between your spirit self and your physical self by becoming more and more aware of how it is your body is interacting with the world. It's something like that. That's my hip pocket definition of meditation for you. And so we have, in the very first phase of the program, we have a device that sort of puts your body into that state artificially. And the way it does that is, there's a certain brainwave pattern that advanced meditators get themselves to that you can measure. And it usually takes a lot of practice to be able to kind of get there. But this device kind of does it for you, which is kind of cool. For me, it's more of like a taking device. But anyway, it's kind of an onboarding tool. And then we've got other devices that provide real-time feedback of where the nervous system is while you're meditating, and gives you cues to angle your thoughts toward. So that's how meditation plays into our program.
Cool. Yeah. And you mentioned the word discipline, and I think that's it's an important part of just daily life, but especially when you're undergoing like a program like yours, you have to be disciplined. You have to be willing to put in the effort and work into it. And for me, when I speak on my personal experience, the military is a very disciplined place to be. It's this heightened sense of discipline that we all have to go through. For me, it carried over, it transferred into civilian life when I got out. I just carried over the discipline, and that just spread throughout everything else I was trying to do to a degree that was almost unhealthy. And I guess, for other people, you could almost regress in that way. Like when you're just hyper disciplined, it could regress backwards. And you kind of separate yourself from the intensely disciplined organization that you were just a part of. Is discipline something that you guys have had to had I guess have had issues with when people or go into this program? Did you have people dropping out, so to speak, because they can't fulfill the standards of what they're trying to go through?
When we're onboarding people into the program, we have to be cognizant of the fact that there are people on different ends of the spectrum when it comes to discipline, where there are some who getting out of the bed at, by 8 a.m. is like a huge challenge. There are others where you give them a set of tasks and it's like, I'm going to do everything 100% to the T. And well, how do you work with both of those people? And so for the latter, a good reminder of like, hey, look, maybe 80-20, you know what I mean? So like maybe 80% of the time you're nailing your nutrition goals, you're taking time for yourself to meditate. And then like maybe you don't have to be perfect in 100% of the areas. So there's an exercise that I do where you have basically like 8 to 10 different domains of life. And in one column, you write down like how much effort on a scale of 1 to 10 are you putting into each of those domains. But you can't put 10 on all of them. It's just not possible. You don't have that capacity. And then in the next column, you rate like what's your satisfaction level of each of those, given the amount of effort that you have. And then in the final column, it's what would be your ideal amount of effort into each of those that would lead to your best satisfaction in each bucket. So the idea there is to display you can't be 100% in 100% of the areas all of the time. It's not possible. So let's set some good expectations and realize, hey, maybe for this season, if you're really interested in like reading and that comes somewhat at the expense of physical movement, maybe that's okay. And then maybe you have another season where you try this other thing and another season where you try this other thing. And then you kind of settle into a rhythm where you have like, look, every day at 8, I'm going to do breath work. But then around it, it's negotiable. So the question is like, what things need to be non-negotiable and what things need to be negotiable? And then to what degree does that whole scenario need to be negotiable across time? So it's teaching that wisdom of knowing when do I lay down the gas and when do I put the brakes on certain things. But like that whole process of figuring out what works for me and how is it sustainable, you still have to start somewhere. You still have to decide, like for each person, so a mark of a good facilitator, which all of ours I would qualify for, I might say, is that they can understand for one participant, making it up a flight of stairs without being out of breath at the top is a win. And that win can be just as significant as someone who just ran a 50K. So it's the art of kind of meeting people where they are and totally withholding some sort of like value judgment on either of those. Like it's good to celebrate either one in that degree. There's that parable of the talents where you had this landowner basically, and he gives one guy 1 unit of resource, he gives one guy 2 and one guy 5. And the guy with 2 and the guy with 5, they both double it to 4 and 10 respectively. And the response to both of them, even though they had different numbers, is like, well done, good and faithful servant. You took what you had and you multiplied it. That's awesome. That's kick-ass, right? I'm not concerned about the number. But then the guy who was given 1 unit of resource just buried it and didn't do anything with it. And that was the servant that was considered wicked, because even though his capacity was lower, he didn't do anything with it. There's the bar to do just something with what you've been given is very low. And like even in the story, it was like you could have just taken it to a bank and dropped it off to get interest. But I guess that kind of gets back to your question earlier of who would do well in this program. And it's the person who's willing to, at the very least, put that single talent in the in the bank to see some type of a return. It's not somebody who, like, yes, I read all of my books, I did 100% of the things all the time. I'm willing to engage in this process and make it work for me.
Yeah, totally. I like your point on meeting people where they are, because everyone's, if life's a race, everyone's on a different starting line. Everybody starts there. Everyone's on their own path. You can't compare the two. And I think that's, something important to realize is, this comparison is just, can be detrimental to somebody's growth journey. And, I think it's an important point to kind of resonate with. So yeah, I don't want to take up too much more of your time, but I would like to kind of, I would like to kind of have this time to kind of share. Actually, one more question though. what is when you sign up to do this, how is it? How is it structured? Is it online or is it like in person? How does it work?
Yeah, so it's actually a decentralized program, which was great because that we had that idea prior to everything closing down in early 2020. So it's delivered via a box, but you'll also get a personalized call from one of our staff to kind of get an understanding of where you're at and what you're after.
Mm.
And the coaching calls are pretty much all done online. Now, every once in a while, we'll have participants who realize like, oh, there's some other people in my area and they've met up for hikes and stuff like that. And the more the program grows, the more that type of stuff could be available. Mission 22 also has a very broad ambassador network that puts on events across the country. And some R&R participants have gone to some of those for networking. And you can find a list of those events on our website. So to answer your question, it's mostly decentralized, but there are definitely opportunities to go see in-person people in your area potentially.
Cool. Yeah, I think that's a good thing to have, in-person contact with other people. So if you want to like take this time to kind of shout out your website or anything that Mission 22 does or yourself personally does, to kind of share with whoever's listening.
Sure. So I kind of mentioned before, it's just mission22.com. We're also on most of the social media platforms. It's going to be at Mission 22 or something close to that. I think Instagram and Facebook are slightly different tags, but it should be pretty easy to find us. I published a book back about 2 years ago that kind of documented some of my own personal journey and sorting through all this. It's
Cool.
on nolessfaithfulbook.com. It's also available on Amazon if anyone's interested in that. And yeah, come check us out.
Sweet. Yeah. If you don't mind sending me the links to those, and I'll definitely put them in the description.
Will do.
Yeah, of course. Well, thanks, Marcus. I really appreciate your time. It's been great talking to you. I've really learned a lot, especially it's been pretty fruitful in my understanding of like how different people react to getting out of their service, and I think it's really important because it's something that I've dealt with, and I think every service member deals with, whether they realize it or not. And it's really important work you guys are doing. So appreciate you being on. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Evan. Appreciate you.